Thanks so much for joining, Roger. Really pleased to have you on the podcast. As I mentioned to you, the general kind of cut and thrust of the podcast has been around the impact of not. So when thinking about times where, maybe we've kind of had budgets tighten and purse strings close a little bit, particularly in the wake of, various different kind of global economic factors, what are things that could typically be seen as value add and requiring a little bit more investment versus, what would be the impact of not doing those things later on. So thanks again so much for joining. I don't know if maybe you would like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, of course. No, good to see you again, Hope. So Roger Minton, long career in HR, most areas of HR, in fact, talent acquisition being the one exception, so I'll leave that to you experts. But the last 10, 12 years, I've really chosen to specialise in talent and leadership development, just a fascinating area. I think that if you get it right, it can make such an impact to business performance. And that career has been through permanent roles, interim, consulting, a whole range of things. In fact, it strikes me that I've been called everything from contractor to consultant to part-time worker to employee to interim. And I often ask myself, does the nature of the contract make any difference to what I do? And I think the answer is no. So whatever the longevity of it, or the permanence or not, I'm always trying to look at the horizon and say, whether it was me or not, how do you get to the horizon and what do you put in place now?
Yeah, amazing. Thank you for that. I'm really, really pleased to have you here. I think we've had some really interesting conversations in depth about the importance of leadership development, the way in which you've gone about it in various of your really interesting roles and staging and timing and stuff. So I'm really looking forward to taking a bit of a dive into that, particularly in relation to this point and what would happen if you didn't do it. I guess I'd be quite interested to understand a little bit about maybe a particular kind of project or particular kind of scope of work, or just leadership development in general. What is it about that you think is so important?
And your point's right that in tough times the easy things seemingly in the short term to save some money on are of course talent, leadership development, talent acquisition to some extent, but the wise organisations I think ignore that temptation. Because even if this year we can save some money, they know that next year and further down the track you're going to suffer from it. So one example is a mining company I worked for recently, and they rode out the financial crash, which hit them like everybody really hard, then the pandemic, and they maintained spend on talent and leadership development through both of those disasters, basically.
They must have been one of the only ones of that profile doing that as well.
I think so, yes. And the financial crash, of course, money was the issue of the future. And then the pandemic required completely reimagining how you deliver leadership development. So this particular company, it was fully face-to-face. So they flew plane loads of people across the planet for every leadership program, which is the reason I was hired in June 2020 to say, how on earth do we keep doing this? We want to spend the money and invest, but we don't know how to.
That must have been quite the challenge, because I think COVID was an interesting time, wasn't it? Because so many people like yourself, it's kind of come and fix this problem, Roger. We need your help to figure out how to do it, and then you've got to then figure out how to do it and deliver.
And in truth, no one had the answer to that.
Yeah.
So you would have heard at the time business schools running around saying, we've done virtual learning for years, it's not a problem. We really haven't, and I say we because I work for one. We've done snippets of it in service of the face-to-face, magic in the room kind of stuff. So it was a total reimagining. And just one example, we had a top talent program. These were sort of mid-level managers with potential for the most senior roles. And it had run twice with 100 participants, high touch, glamorous location, expensive hotel, all the exec team in and out, and no one could even imagine how you could recreate that when you're sat at your desk or in your home.
Yeah, it's an interesting, because with exec, it's, often you talk about things like white glove service and, experience being, of course you want a good people experience for your whole workforce, but there is something a little bit more tangible with the exec population or the leadership population, high potential, etc. So how did you even approach that and think, how can we translate that to
I think we tried to replace the So a lot of the prestige, of course, as well as the environment, was around having the most senior leaders present. So we maintained that, and actually found out in some ways that's easier. Because if you require the whole exec team to be in Germany for 2 days in a certain month, that's really hard to pull off. Whereas having them joining for an hour and a half's town hall, for example, virtually in their day is possible wherever they are in the world. One example is business simulations. So I'd run those in classrooms many times, really impactful way of learning, and thought, is that going to work? And we found it was actually better. So the intimacy of these small teams of 4 or 5 people with a coach, I would coach one of these teams, making decisions, interacting with each other, all the behaviours playing out when you're under pressure, which you are in that situation. Although it was a virtual room, it was incredibly intimate. And by the end of the few days, you knew them inside out, you had feedback conversations. So actually some things worked better than expected.
That's really interesting. And going back to a point that you mentioned, because when you're talking about the fact that with this mining company, throughout these hard times, they had invested in things like talent and leadership development. Why do you think that was?
I think it's a long-term industry, of course. To create a new mine takes about 20 years from starting to scope it.
I didn't know it was that long.
It's a really long time. One of the problems the world faces right now is we're going to need more copper, for example, soon, and it takes 20 years to open up a new mine. So I think they're used to thinking longer term, investing over much longer time periods, therefore not being as terrified by short-term shocks. Having said that, those were so extreme, financial crash. I applaud the fact that they kept their eye on the prize.
Yeah. And how did you find the buy-in from the business?
I think that was the key to it, to be honest. That's why people from the CEO downwards, the CEO had been through one of these programs in the past. We called it the Leadership Academy. That
saw the value of it.
Exactly. And having them closely involved, not just in turning up, but actually designing it. So I would pick a sponsor at exec team level for each of those senior talent programs, and they would actively influence what the content looked like, as well as having a presence and engaging with those people. So I'm sure that's one of the reasons, because it's much easier to maintain investment, isn't it, if you're personally involved and see the value, than if it's just, well, we've got this thing running, can we save the money? And
then you're always like an ambassador for it with everyone else. If you've got some of the kind of harder to reach, maybe stakeholder population, it's like, oh, so-and-so is got this profile in the business and really sees the value, is telling us to do it, it must be good, like let's all engage.
And I think that's a clue to the sponsor. You're exactly right. Having a business sponsor, not just defaulting to the chief people officer, who everyone would expect to sponsor this kind of thing. So it was one of the CEOs of one of the biggest businesses. This guy ran half the company basically in production terms. People listen to that.
Yeah, they do. Amazing. And thinking about all of this, because it sounds like you delivered some really cool stuff, like quite tangible change in an environment that was, the most complex, arguably, really, pandemic. What was where did you kind of end up with it? How would you?
Yeah, it's a good question, because if I take that top talent program I just mentioned, so my steerco decided once that we could travel again, the restrictions were lifted, we stuck with virtual.
Did you?
Big debate about it. I expected, and there was to some extent a push to say, oh good, we can now get on the plane again.
Yeah.
But I resisted that because I'd seen the impact of the program. The feedback was so strong, and the exec team had all been closely involved. So in fact, they've stuck with it to this day.
And presumably that saved, financially that's had an impact as well.
It does, but not the design and delivery. So design and delivery was at least as expensive. In fact, in some cases, there was more time involved because it was all new formats and platforms and approaches. Yes, of course, you save a lot of flights and an expensive hotel, so it ends up cheaper. But this company could afford those bills, but still chose to say, actually, this worked so well,
because it had a better impact.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And then, so thinking about all of this and how good it was, and the fact that this business, were fortunately thinking in the long term and thinking about continuing that development, because presumably when they came out of the pandemic, everyone's in a pretty good nick with as relates to leadership development, because that's been consistently acted on in that time. And I think you'll probably remember, if you think when we started coming out of the pandemic and we hit 2021, all of a sudden, it's, gosh, we need to hire, we need to bring in talent, we need to, fix our learning, we need to bring in more people for people experience, and
Yes.
the hiring went up and up and up, and it must have been, you know, you must have felt in quite a good spot.
I think that's one of the things that did pull them out a bit. The fact
Yeah.
that this sort of beacon, this leadership academy for high potential people particularly, was still there. So they had a sort of North Star to look at and say, yes, okay, the world's changed, home lives as well as work lives, but actually this company is still serious about
And look
this
what
stuff.
we've done.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. What would happen, do you think, if you hadn't have done any of that? You know, what do you think? Because, like, as you say, it wasn't the cheaper option necessarily.
No.
You know, you know, the money's supposed to be being saved on the flights and the hotels and such, but actually there was a lot of investment from, you know, commercially to go into delivering these programs and continuing them throughout the pandemic. What would you say would be the impact perhaps on, well, just generally if that investment hadn't have been made?
Yeah, I mean, we did measure that to some extent.
Did you?
So the academy programs were all dedicated to high potential. So it's talent populations that we're talking about. And we were able to prove that people who had been through one of those programs within the last 5 years, we measured it, stayed longer.
Right.
Were rated as better managers by their direct reports. So we were able to tag all those people. It was about 700 people through the employee survey.
Brilliant.
To show that those people had been through. So there was a real...
And did you see the difference between those who were in those programs and those who weren't?
Yes,
in those scores?
that's really that's what we were measuring.
Ah,
comparing
fantastic.
people in the talent population, those who had attended an academy program versus those who hadn't. So it was quite a powerful measure.
That's fantastic.
First time I've managed to prove it to that extent, I think.
Yeah. And it's, I mean, amazing to kind of have been able to see that journey, you know, really kind of come from the point of, you know, really needing to make the impact to look, this is
right.
This is what we've done.
Exactly.
That's fantastic. And so what would you know, if you're thinking about kind of broader organisations and these types of leadership development programmes, you know, ultimately if you were to characterise, you know, in your view and your professional experience, having done this for, you know, for some time, what would you think would be, you know, the challenge if businesses generally didn't invest in their leadership development?
Yes, I've got a good story that illustrates that, I think.
Okay.
So another client of mine that I've worked with off and on for about 12 years, since 2012, academic publisher that at the time had identified a cohort of about 30 high potentials for the most senior roles, didn't know what to do with them, and I got hired to come in and design a development journey to get them ready. So that was 2012, 2013 that ran. I went back to that client last year, 10, 11 years later, to find that several of those people were in executive team roles and many the one level below, so a high retention rate and high promotion rate. And I interviewed them, said, so what is it, first of all, about that program, what are you now saying, what did it not give you? So now you're on the exec team, did you look around and say, Minton, why on earth didn't you cover that? Because that would really have helped. And their answer to that, in every case, actually was primarily commercial. Was saying we did some work on P&Ls and basic understanding, but now I'm on the exec team, you know, I have to be part of these broad enterprise decisions. So I'd have liked a bit more preparation for that response. What did it do for you? They all said, I wouldn't have got to this senior job without it. Well, why not? Because of the breadth, so it plucked them out of their functional silo. They were sort of mid-level managers. It plucked them out of the academic publishing business to the parent company level, because it's owned by a much bigger group.
Which is so different, isn't it?
Totally different. They got to meet the CEO of the parent company, interact with some of their exec team, and some of those formed kind of mentoring, informal relationships. And they said, without that, we would never have ended up on the exec team.
Interesting. And I think there's a real pull for an organisation for grow your own talent, isn't there? I think if you're joining a business and you can see that on the exec teams that you've got, you know, at least a good percentage that have come up through the business, you know, of course you anticipate that there will be need to kind of have a bit of cross-pollination with external individuals, but you'd be a bit hesitant, I think, particularly if you were in a, you know, maybe let's say you're in a kind of middle manager sort of, you know, and you know that your goal is to get to director of X field. If you were to join an organisation and notice that at the top level there's no one that had kind of come up through the ranks of the business, or very few, you know, from an attraction point of view, you're probably a bit hesitant there. And then you would imagine then, and to your point on retention generally, you know, and then engagement, I expect, as you know, sees an impact there too. There's all sorts of different
There is
quite tangible challenges if you don't get that right.
Yeah, and I think what you're touching on there is, so in that example with the publisher, had we not done that investment 10 years ago, imagine the cost of headhunting fees.
Well, yeah.
2 or 3 executive team roles, so there's a cost there. There's also, of course, much higher risk if you parachute people in. And what you've just mentioned, what message does that send to the high potentials in the organisation?
Yeah.
Every time there's a key vacancy, someone gets brought in from outside and sometimes succeeds and sometimes fails. And I think when you asked about, what are the approaches to achieving that, it is the level of customization, I think, of the leadership development.
Yeah.
So people are clear on individual impact, so you can send some of your best people off to the best business schools, and of course they're going to learn a lot and they're going to get some value from that. Will there be much organizational impact? Probably not. Whereas if you invest that money in cohorts in a program that's designed completely around that organization, elevating them out of it as well, and focusing on the values of this company and the purpose and where it's trying to get to, the strategy, with the sponsorship that we talked about earlier, that seems to make the organisational impact that you'll never get if you use a bunch of open enrolment programs.
Yeah, and it's interesting, leadership development, because I think sometimes it might sit with I think you can really see where it sits in a business and how much is going into that investment. And I think a lot of people in the talent space really champion that and are really passionate about leadership development. But it's interesting when you look at how many organisations have actually got someone that's solely focused on leadership development, that is there to really partner with the business and look at getting that buy-in and investment to deliver these programs.
Yeah.
Where do you see it going?
It is shifting, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, it's shifted several times already, hasn't it? So in that mining company example, it absolutely sat within talent. We had leadership development, talent acquisition, executive recruitment, performance management, and talent management all sat with it. And there we were able to connect up. So these academy programs might be fabulous, but are they connected to the right people? So we made sure that people were always on a succession plan before they got nominated, so you knew you were developing the right people. So that was one iteration of the way it's been done. However, that's all about talent and high potential, which is only ever, 5 or 6% of your leaders. So I think the big shift in the last couple of years is organisations, and this was much of my job at that company, how do we democratise this? Whether 95% of leaders are not getting much, if anything. So is the investment proportionate? Of course you need to invest in your future leaders. And I think that drives where it sits as well. You could take more of a learning argument to that than purely leadership development. So I think there is a shifting around of where it best sits. But the exposure that you mentioned is key.
Yeah.
The level of focus that it gets from the exec team.
And I suppose that's the beauty of being able to show, like your example with when you kind of reach the end of that program with the mining company, when you are able to demonstrate the fact that you've had all of these differences in outcome and I'm trying to find the right word.
Impact, really.
Impact, yes, that's it. And ultimately, to a business leader, that's what they want to see, right? It's what is this doing to further the organisational plans? Is it revenue or growth or whatever? You want to be able to show how that all fits, don't you?
Yeah, they've got data, really key, and also they felt it. There's something about that. I think having been involved, having seen these people develop, having played a role in encouraging.
Because culture, I feel like that's such a big thing, isn't it? With if when you're speaking to, in my job, if I'm speaking to different leaders that are kind of going through their motivators and why they want to leave their current role or what might draw them somewhere else, I think money's not that high on the list. Like it's important in terms of being equitable for the role. I think that's what tends to be the main thread with compensation. But actually, before that's ever said, it's how is what I'm doing viewed in the business? What's the impact I can have? What's the growth opportunities? What's the culture? And I think things like kind of being able to say, well, you kind of join and they have got this brilliant program to be able to invest in long-term development, and they've done this already, and this has been the impact. I think there's so many different areas that you can look at it from, I think, aren't there?
Yes, yeah, and if you think of the individuals, their expectations of their managers are just ever increasing, which is another case for leadership development. I think that, you know, the expectations of people are now flexibility, understand my personal situation, you know, develop me, all these things, as well as, yes, you need to pay me, of course, that's an essential, but it's not the thing that will differentiate from me going to this organisation from
That's right.
one.
That's right.
We talked about the return to work mandates, didn't we, just a little bit before this call? And I think that's a really good example that there's a real risk, isn't there? People will vote with their feet if there's an alternative job, and that's not about whether you're in the office or not. I think it's more about autonomy and trust, and, you know, am I treated as a grown-up to make decisions about where I can be most effective.
I was having this exact same conversation yesterday, actually, with someone about the 5 days a week thing, and it's exactly that. You know, I think we've all done 5 days a week in the office, and you know, a lot of people will have reasons. Particularly, I think COVID accelerated the move, didn't it, to having a bit more flexibility. And I think since, you know, realising that, I think it's become very important to people for a multitude of reasons. But most people that I speak to don't, you know, they're not against coming into an office. They see the real value in having that that human touch. But what they don't want is a bit of an autocratic, you must be in on these days because I don't believe you're not going to work if you're not, kind of thing. And I think that's often perception if you're you know, with this sort of thing.
Group of very senior CEOs, definitely.
That's right. Be interesting with all of that. I think with it'd be interesting to see kind of what the future of all of this, you know, of broad talent, you know, investment into some of these things. Because I think we've made some real strides. You know, you mentioned earlier joining the dots between, you know, the sort of retention and the development and how leadership development sort of sits across all of that, I suppose. But I think there's still a bit of a ways to go, isn't there?
Long way. Yes, a long way. I think those things I just mentioned about how you weave leadership development into what the organisation is trying to achieve. You know, it can be something separate, can't it? And you can have programs sat over here whilst the company is trying to go over there, and that clearly doesn't work. And the only answer to that is this customised approach, this design process, and involving senior leaders in it. Yeah.
What would you say to an organisation that doesn't necessarily invest in leadership development and was maybe thinking about what they might achieve by doing so?
Yes, I mean, presumably they've been successful so far without it, so that's where the case becomes harder to make, of course, but I think we all know the world's shifting, so it might have worked so far, it might have got you here, but it won't get you there, would be the classic way of describing it, with ever faster changing world and more ambiguity and leaders having to operate in these sort of vacuums of not having enough data and information, as well as their employees having higher expectations and different expectations of them as leaders. I think for those reasons, they need to start investing if they haven't done it yet.
Yeah, I agree.
And of course, that's not all about money. Some of it is time. I've seen some really successful programs delivered fully internally. My current client delivers its high potential program for its most senior people fully internally.
Yeah.
They might bring in the occasional external speaker, but it's delivered by internal people, and that's great.
I think we've all benefited from that as well, you know, peer mentoring, development from, you know, internally other business leaders that are showing you what they've done and how they've been successful. You know, I think there's ways that you can do it that don't involve loads of spend, isn't there?
True. Yes, there are different ways. Time investment, obviously.
Yes.
And companies vary about that, don't they? The one I'm working with is professional services, so there's a real pressure
to be definitely
and time on that, and so on. And that's one of the shifts that we're trying to undergo with the full support of the board to say, of course, that's important, but it's not everything. And you have to make time for learning for all the reasons we've just discussed. If we stand still, we're in trouble.
Well, thank you so much for joining today, Roger. I always enjoy our conversations, and I feel like you're someone that shares a lot of insight just naturally, but it's been so lovely to spend a little bit of time and really dig into some of these areas. So thank you for joining to share your expertise. It's been really great to have you here.
It's been great having the conversation, Hope. Thank you.